There's a record buried in the Velhari archive. Third sublevel, restricted access, classified under unverified contact events, that describes a species called humans. The record is 41 years old. It says they fought a rearguard action at a place called Kessler's Ridge that should have lasted 6 hours. It lasted 19 days. It says they held a supply corridor that 3 separate Dominion war models predicted would collapse within 40 minutes. It says the last confirmed human transmission from that corridor was a piece of music, not a distress call, like not tactical coordinates. Music. The analyst who filed that report recommended the species be flagged as a Category 7 anomaly and monitored. Then, the silence came. Decades of it, and long enough that the monitoring teams were reassigned. Long enough that human became the kind of word soldiers use to scare young recruits. The same way you use ghost stories, with the same embarrassed laugh afterward. I used to laugh too. I'm Severin, Field Intelligence Officer, 3rd Expeditionary Cohort, Velhari Dominion. My rank is Junior Assessor. I carry a flask of Veltar, a beverage my colleagues describe as warm machinery fluid, and I log everything compulsively, even when nothing is happening, because the one time I stopped logging, something happened that I still can't explain in formal language. I'm going to try anyway. This is my account of what occurred at Sector 09 in the 42nd day of the Velhari advance, when the humans stopped being a myth. To be fair, they didn't announce themselves. They rarely do. The first thing that went wrong was the silence. Not the comfortable silence of empty space, which I have cataloged extensively in 17 prior deployments, and which carries a particular frequency, a faint hum of cosmic background radiation that Velhari instruments render as a low, almost subsonic THHH in the audio feed. That silence, I know. That silence has a texture. This was different. This sort of was the silence of something breathing and deciding not to. I noted a timestamp 614.32 in my log. Sector 09, anomalous signal gap. Duration, 11 seconds. Plus, no equipment fault detected. Then I closed the log, took a long pull from my flask of Veltar, and told myself the equipment was wrong. Equipment is frequently wrong. That is, professionally speaking, its primary function, and the advance had been clean. That's the word Command kept using in their dispatches. Clean. 42 days since the Dominion ground forces pushed through the Crescent Belt. 42 days of exactly the kind of strategic tidiness that makes senior officers write self-congratulatory memos. Sector 09 was, to be fair, a communications relay hub, or had been before the belt collapsed. Now it was a hollowed-out tangle of old prefab structures, dead signal towers, and debris field from whatever engagement had burned through here 6 years ago. The kind of place that smells, even through a sealed filtration unit, of old metal and older fire. My job was to confirm the sector was clear of residual personnel, log any remaining intelligence assets, and flag anything unusual for the archive teams following behind us. It was, to be precise, the assignment given to officers who are technically competent, but whom command doesn't particularly want near anything important. I've been assigned to it for reasons I won't detail here, except to say they involved a prior incident, a misclassified signal, and a very senior officer's personal transport that I'd, with good intentions and bad judgment, flagged as a potential hostile incursion. The transport had been fine, which the officer had not forgotten. So, 09, me, kind of a field unit of 12 Velhari ground soldiers under the command of cohort leader Rethis, and a satellite relay station that had been silent for 6 years. We landed at 0540. By 0600, Rethis had confirmed what the aerial survey already told us. The station was structurally intact, mostly powered down, showing residual heat signatures consistent with recent, very recent, life support activity. Squatters, Rethis said, which he had the particular confidence of a soldier who had never been surprised by anything, and therefore assumed surprise was no longer possible. Refugees from the Crescent camps. They drift in my opinion, they drift out. We clear them, we document, we leave. I wrote that down. I wrote everything down. It is a habit that began as anxiety management and calcified into compulsion sometime around my 3rd year in the field. My colleagues find it irritating. I find it useful. Right now, I find it the only thing keeping me from focusing too hard on the silence. 614.32 plus 11 seconds. No equipment fault. For what it's worth, I logged it again. Honestly, second notation. Then, I followed like Rethus's unit into the station. The interior of the relay hub was arranged across 4 levels, each one progressively more stripped. The lower levels, originally communications processing bays, had been thoroughly gutted, cabling pulled from the walls and left in rusting tangles. Consoles dark, emergency lighting still functional, but running on residual cell power, casting everything in that particular bruised amber that makes your depth perception slightly unreliable and your instincts slightly wrong. I work through it by timestamp, and the sound of Rethus's boots ahead of me. Level 3, basically, is where cohort soldier Vinsot found the food. Not alien food. Vinsot wouldn't have paused for alien food. He had been in this sector for 6 months and had developed a field soldier's pragmatic indifference to both alien cuisine and alien suffering, which I note here not as criticism, but as context. What made him stop was the packaging. He held it up. A foil-wrapped rectangle, slightly crushed, with printed text in a language that the Dominion's linguistic banks recognized in approximately 0.4 seconds. Velhari Standard Translation. Emergency Ration. Field Issue. Human Confederacy Logistics Division. Rethus took it from him, turned it over, and set his expression to the particular blankness that Velhari commanders adopt when they're recalculating something they had previously decided not to calculate. Date stamp, I said. Rethus looked at me. The look actually said, "You're the intelligence officer, you tell me." I pulled out my scanner and told him. 14 days to be fair ago. The room went quiet. Not the silence from outside. This was the silence of 12 trained soldiers and 1 field intelligence officer, all arriving at the same conclusion by slightly different routes. The Crescent Belt had been under Dominion blockade for 42 days. Nothing in, nothing out. That was Command's language, and Command's language, in my experience, tends to be optimistic. But 14 days. That was inside the blockade. That meant either someone had broken through the Dominion line, which the war models said was a probability approaching statistical 0, or someone had been here inside the perimeter for at least the last 2 weeks. Squatters, I said quietly, and Rethus didn't respond. He, I think, was already talking into his command channel. I logged the ration wrapper. Time-stamped the scan. Then, I noticed the wrapper had a small handwritten mark on one corner. Not in any script I recognized. A quick slash and a dot, repeated 3 times. I logged that too. Plus, I didn't know why. TBH, habit. We found the second sign 20 minutes later. Level like 2, second junction, a section of wall that the original survey had logged as structurally compromised and flagged for avoidance. Rethus had routed us around it, but I've been watching the ambient temperature readings on my scanner, a residual habit from my signals training, and there's a faint thermal differential bleeding from behind that wall that shouldn't have been there if the section was truly empty. I told Rethus. He gave me the look again. Then he sent Vinsot to check. The wall panel was magnetic sealed from the inside. The seal was recent enough that the adhesive was still slightly flexible when Vinsot pressed it. Someone had come through this wall in the last day or 2, resealed it, and expected us not to check. Rethus ordered the panel opened. Behind a crawl corridor, roughly 2 Velhari body widths wide, running parallel to the main junction for about 30 spans before turning. Dark. Plus, temperature slightly improved. And at the near end, wedged into the corner where the corridor met the turn, a device that I recognized from Dominion intelligence files as a human-manufactured acoustic dampener. TBH, which explained the silence. The silence at 614.32 had not been equipment failure. Someone had activated a dampening field, realized it was registering on external sensors, and switched it off. 11 seconds. Exactly the kind of duration consistent with a manual adjustment. Someone checking a dial, noticing the bleed, correcting. There was someone in this station who didn't want to be found and was very good at not being found, but who had made, in 11 seconds, one small imperfect decision. Rethus looked at the dampener. He looked at me. He looked at the corridor. Squatters, he said, but differently this time. The word was hollowing out even as he said it, and we both knew it. I logged 641.08, confirmed human presence, and Sector 09 not clear. Recommend, immediate. The lights went out, and not all of them. Not the emergency amber, just the secondary lighting, the full-spectrum ceiling panels that Rethys had activated on entry, the ones that made the place feel less like a tomb. 1 second bright, next second gone, and in that 1 second the soldiers moved exactly as trained. Formation, backs to walls, weapons up. Nothing happened, which 20 seconds. 30 to be fair. Vinsat said something in the clipped register Velhari soldiers use when they're maintaining professionalism over a more immediate impulse, and Rethys told him to be quiet. I was watching my scanner. The thermal differential from behind the wall had shifted. Slightly. The way a thermal differential shifts when a warm body changes position. Someone was in that corridor. Someone had just moved. The thing I remember most clearly, and I've reviewed this part of my log perhaps 40 times in the week since, is that I wasn't scared yet. Fear requires the brain to catch up to a situation, and my brain, at that precise moment, was still trying to file everything correctly. I think humans. Here, inside the blockade, using a military-grade acoustic dampener. I guess cutting lights remotely. The signal gap at 0614 had lasted 11 seconds because someone had spotted us on approach and killed the dampener before we landed. Honestly, before we landed. Plus, they've been watching us come in. They've been watching us for at least 20 minutes before we even stepped off the transport. I noted for what it's worth that in the log. I noted it twice. Then, I guess, I noted that the dampener in the crawl corridor was now active again. The next 40 minutes were a specific kind of terrible, the kind where nothing happens and everything is happening. Basically, Rethys split the unit. 6 soldiers stayed with me at the level 2 junction. The other 6, with Rethys, moved to cover the access points on level 1, sealing exits, operating on the assumption that whoever was here would eventually have to move. The assumption was reasonable. It was based on Velhari tactical doctrine for confined structure search operations, which is thorough and which has been field-tested across several hundred engagements over the last 40 years. I'd read the doctrine, and I'd even taught a portion of it, briefly, before the incident with the senior officer's transport. The doctrine doesn't have a section for what happens when the target is managing 3 separate tactical problems you haven't identified yet, while you're busily solving the one problem they want you to think about. I know that now, which at the time, I was watching thermals and logging. 0648, no movement. 0652, dampener still active. 0655, temperature in crawl corridor dropping. That last one was interesting. A warm body doesn't just stop generating heat unless it stopped moving entirely. Or, I flagged it to Rethys. He told me to stand by. At 0657, Vinsat, 2 spans to my left, put his hand down on the floor to brace himself while he adjusted his scanner angle, and then made a sound I'd never heard a trained Velhari soldier make before. I looked at where his hand was. There was a partial boot print. Pretty much human-sized, human-shaped, pointing not toward the crawl corridor, not toward any of the sealed exits Rethys had covered, but toward the level 3 access shaft, the one we'd come up through, the one that led back to our transport. The temperature drop in the crawl corridor had been a decoy. I had my communicator open before I finished processing that thought, and I heard myself saying to Rethys across the channel in a voice I won't describe because it is documented in the log, and I have no interest in revisiting it. They're behind us. Rethys' channel went quiet for 2 seconds that felt, in the architecture of that moment, significantly longer. Then, from level 1, I heard a voice, not a Velhari voice, say something brief and accented but functional Velhari standard. We're not here to fight you. 6 words. I guess even unhurried, the voice had the particular quality of someone who had rehearsed the sentence enough times that it no longer held any tension for them. Like they were reading off a list, which step 1, don't get shot. Say the words. Rethys said, also to be fair, in standard, show yourself. A pause. Then you've got 12 armed soldiers, and I got a very bad feeling about my odds. Give me a reason. Despite everything, despite the logs, the thermal drift, the 11 seconds of careful misdirection, the boot print I was still staring at, I had to physically prevent myself from logging the exact tone of that voice, because the tone didn't fit any of the frameworks I'd been given for understanding beings under tactical duress. It was almost conversational. Look, not panicked, not aggressive, almost like someone haggling at a supply dock. Rethys said, Sector 09 is under Dominion jurisdiction. You're in a controlled zone. Identify yourself and stand down. Another pause. Then, that's not actually a reason. Try again. I drank my Veltar. It was cold by now. It tasted, as sort of my colleagues often said, like warm machinery fluid that had since cooled down and developed regrets. I was logging again. Compulsively, which time, date, exact transcript, thermal readings, everything. I noted that the voice was coming from level 1, from inside the perimeter Rethys had established to contain the target. I noted that the exit to our transport, which the human had been moving toward before they spoke, was still technically accessible. I noted that the human had stopped moving toward it. They could potentially have reached the transport and created a significantly more complicated tactical situation. They had chosen not to. They had chosen instead to say 6 words into a radio channel and wait. I wrote in the log why. Didn't have an answer. I still don't have a complete one, but I have 42 more days of material to work through, and I'm getting closer. Rethys, to his credit, adapted faster than doctrine suggested he should. He kept his 6 soldiers on level 1 positioned, weapons ready, while he processed the fact that the individual he was attempting to contain had already, at some point in the last 40 minutes, moved through his containment and chosen not to exploit it. Identify, he said again. Flatter this time. Plus, the word stripped of command register and replaced with something quieter and more careful. A beat, which then, Maddox. Basically, Raina Maddox. Confederacy 14th Intelligence, detached. I'm not, here on a mission. I'm here because this station has the only functioning long-range relay array in a 3-sector radius, and I have a message I need sent. I logged the name, the rank, kind of the unit. My scanner cross-referenced. The 14th Intelligence Division was listed in Dominion threat assessments as a deep penetration unit specializing in prolonged autonomous field operation. High-value assets, typically deployed alone or in pairs. Prolonged autonomous field operation. She TBH had been in this sector inside our blockade for at least 2 weeks. Alone, living on field rations in a dead relay station in the dark. Not because she was hiding from us, namely, we hadn't been here 2 weeks ago, but because this was simply what her mission required, and she was doing it the way you drink water when you're thirsty. Without drama. Rethys said, "What message?" That's between me and whoever I'm sending it to. That's not how this works. I know. I'm being optimistic. Rethys looked at me through the channel. Not literally, but I could tell. I was the intelligence officer, and this was technically my domain. I clear my throat. I said, "If we make easier the transmission, would you be willing to allow us to log the frequency and destination?" A longer pause this time. "That's a much better reason," she said. Plus, she, to be fair, came out of the level 1 access conduit without a weapon raised. Rethys' soldiers had her at their center point before she'd fully cleared the frame, and she stood there and let them look at her the way you let airport security scan you, with a patient, slightly bored expression of someone who has been through this particular inconvenience many times. She was sort of not what I expected. I don't know exactly what I expected. The threat assessments don't include photographs, and the stories, the old ones, the ones that circulated in barracks and briefing rooms like folklore, had a way of inflating their subjects' past recognition. What I expected was something larger, perhaps. Something more architecturally suited to the myth. What I got was a human of medium height in a field suit that had been repaired in at least 4 places with materials that were not original components. Her hair was shorter on one side than the other in a way that suggested practical cutting rather than style. There was a burn scar on her left forearm that disappeared under the suit cuff. She was carrying a pack that looked too heavy for someone who had been subsisting on emergency rations for 2 weeks, and she had the eyes, and I logged it immediately, of someone who had stopped being afraid of the current situation a while ago, and was now primarily concerned with the next one. She looked at me looking at her. Then, she looked at my flask. "Is that Veltar?" she said. "Yes," I said. "It's awful," she said. "I've been rationing mine for a week and a half. Do you have any to spare?" I gave her the flask. I don't know why. It was cold, and it tasted like machinery, and I've been trained in 6 specific protocols for handling contact with potentially hostile foreign intelligence personnel, none of which involved giving them beverages. She drank, well, and made a face that confirmed every opinion I'd ever held about Veltar. Handed the flask back. "Thanks," she said. "Actually, okay. Show me to your relay array." Rethys looked at me. I looked at my log. 714.22. I wrote, "She's been here 14 days. She's rationed our beverage. Plus, she knows this station better than we do. She stopped pretty much, moving toward our transport the moment she had a better option. She was never trying to escape. She was waiting for someone to negotiate with." I closed the log. I looked at Rethis. I looked at Maddox, who had already turned toward the level 2 corridor with the easy familiarity of someone navigating their own apartment in the dark. "Follow her," I said, "but log everything." He didn't look convinced. Neither was I. But I followed her anyway, and I kept writing, and the relay array was on level 4, and she knew exactly where it was, and I had 17 more questions that I didn't yet have the framework to ask. The first one, and the one that has stayed with me longest, I wrote in the log at 0715 and didn't answer until much later. If she's been here alone for 2 weeks, what was she waiting for us to do? Level 4 smelled like burnt circuitry and old decisions. I logged that too because I log everything and because it was accurate. The relay array had taken partial damage sometime in the 6-year gap. One of the 3 primary transmission nodes had melted into something resembling abstract sculpture, but 2 nodes were intact, and the power routing, according to Maddox, was salvageable. She had already started salvaging it. 2 weeks ago, presumably within her first day of arrival, she had rerouted the backup power cell through what remained of the primary panel, bypassed the authentication locks with a physical override I'd never seen used outside of technical manuals, and generally treated the station's infrastructure with the practiced ease of someone who has long since stopped asking permission from hardware. I watched her work, and Rethis watched me watching her. His soldiers maintained their positions at the level 4 access points with a focused, slightly uncomfortable stillness of trained professionals who have been told to hold a formation that no longer makes complete tactical sense, but haven't yet been told to stand down. I made a note about the bypass. Then, another note about the authentication override. The manual I'd read had listed it as a 2-person operation requiring specialized tools. She had sort of apparently managed it alone. I didn't ask how. The list, to be fair, of things I wanted to ask was getting long enough that I'd started organizing it by category. I was worried that asking too many at once would collapse whatever fragile operating agreement we had arrived at. "You're logging me," she said. Not accusatory, which just observational. "I log everything," I said. "I know. You've been, writing since before we made contact." She didn't look up from the panel. "I could see you through the level 3 access grate. You had your stylus out when you were still on the transport stairs." I processed this for a moment. Then I wrote it down. Shemin glanced over her shoulder, and for a moment her expression did something that was not quite a smile, and not quite its opposite. Something in between, occupying a territory hadn't been issued a map for. "What's your name?" "I think," she said. "Kind of Severin. Field Intelligence. 3rd Expeditionary." "So?" She turned back to the panel. "You're good at watching things." "It's my function." "No, it's your job. Watching is different." A wire connected to something with a soft click. The dead node's indicator light went from black to amber. "You've been watching me, like you're trying to figure out what kind of thing I'm. Not just what I'm doing." I didn't respond because she was correct, and I'd not decided what to do with that yet. Rethis shifted behind me. Honestly, he didn't speak. He had, over the last 20 minutes, settled into a watchful quiet that I recognized from other deployments as the posture of a soldier who has tactically outpaced the situation and is waiting for the situation to catch up. The amber light went green. Maddox leaned back slightly on her heels, a fractional motion barely visible, the kind of physical tell that in Velhari soldiers we call Shemvar, the quiet exhale of attention finally released. She had been carrying something in her shoulder muscles that hadn't noticed until she put it down. She reached into her pack and took out a data drive. Matte black, roughly rectangular, smaller than my scanner, but denser. The weight-to-size ratio was wrong in the way that matters only when you've held a lot of field equipment and developed instincts about density. "I need 12 minutes of transmission time," she said. "Pretty much encrypted. Point to point. I'll give you the frequency log and the destination header, but not the content. That's not standard. I know what it's not. Still that particular unhurried quality. I'm giving you more than I'm required to give you. The frequency log alone will tell your analysts something they need to know. The destination header will tell them something else. That's 2 pieces of intelligence you didn't have an hour ago. What I'm asking is that you give me 12 minutes and don't jam it." Rethis said, if the content is hostile, if it were hostile, she said, I wouldn't need your array. I've had to be fair, weeks to do hostile things with the station, and what I've done is fix the power routing and eat terrible rations and run out of Eltar. A beat, which is saying something, because the rations are worse. Rethus looked at me. I looked like in my log, at the thermal drift, at the boot print, at the 11-second silence, at the fact that she had been moving toward our transport and stopped. Log the frequency. Honestly, I told Rethus. Log everything. Give her 12 minutes. Funny enough, she transmitted for 11 minutes and 40 seconds. I know because I timed it. I also know that the transmission was encrypted in a format my scanner couldn't parse, that the destination header routed through 2 relay nodes I recognized as neutral, not Dominion, not Confederacy, and that the frequency she used was one I'd seen listed exactly once, in a restricted Dominion intelligence assessment marked contingency, sector collapse. I didn't tell Rethus that. I logged it. When the transmission ended, Maddox powered down the node with the same methodical care she had used to power it up. She removed the data drive and returned it to her pack. She stood for a moment looking at the dead panel as though checking something against an internal list, and then she turned and looked at me. Basically, thank you, she said. What did you send? I asked. She considered the question. Not performing consideration, actually working through something. I could see it in the way her eyes unfocused slightly, the way her weight redistributed. Toward her right heel, the minor computational pause of someone deciding how much to give away. A position report, she said, and in my opinion, question. For who? She almost answered. I saw it begin. Then something closed behind her eyes, not unkindly, and she said, someone who needed to know where I was. I logged that. Then I asked the question that had been sitting at the top of my list since level 1. You were moving toward our transport, I said. You had a path. You stopped. She picked up her pack, settled the straps, actually with the small, automatic adjustments of long habit. Yeah, she said. Why? She looked at me for a moment, a direct look, not the scanning look she'd been using since we'd made contact, but something more considered, like she was adding me to a different kind of list. Because running would have created a problem I didn't need. And because you seemed like someone who'd listen to reason. A pause. Was I right? I thought about it, which I wrote it down. Then I said, probably. The not quite smile again. Rethus wanted to hold her for transport to Dominion Command. This was technically doctrine. She was a foreign intelligence operative in a controlled zone. There were procedures. There were always procedures. The Velhari administrative architecture is approximately 60% procedures and 40% people executing procedures while wishing they were doing something else. I said, hold I thank her for what? Rethus listed the relevant codes. I acknowledged the relevant codes. Then I pointed out that she had voluntarily remained in the sector, had voluntarily disclosed her identity, and unit had facilitated an intelligence collection opportunity by agreeing to log the transmission frequency, and had at no point in the preceding 90 minutes made any hostile movement toward any member of our unit despite having had at least 3 clear opportunities. Rethus said that was not the point. I said, what's the point then? Which he didn't answer immediately. Which, for Rethus, was unusual. He was a fast answer sort of commander, the kind who has decided what to do before the situation finishes explaining itself. The hesitation meant the situation had given him something that didn't fit the template. Maddox, who TBH, had been standing next to the dead relay node with her pack on, and the patient expression of someone waiting for a delayed transport, said, I'll make it easier. I'll stay in your custody until you reach your command post. You log me as a detained intelligence contact. I give you a full debrief on the structural condition of this relay station, which I've now spent 2 weeks cataloging, and you pass that to your technical teams. In return, you honestly facilitate whatever communication with Confederacy Command is required by your detention protocols. Rethus stared at her. That's not, he started. It's close enough to protocol that your reports will be defensible, she said. And it means you're not transporting an uncooperative prisoner, which is a different kind of problem. He looked at me. I was already writing. She's right, I said. Log her as a cooperative detained contact. It's cleaner. Rethus was quiet for 4 seconds. Then fine. He gestured to Vinsat. Take custody and light contact protocol. Vinsat looked at Maddox. Maddox looked at Vinsat, and She held out her right hand in a gesture I recognized from the Velhari Standard Cultural Interface Guide as a human greeting display. Vinsat, who had not read the guide, stared at the hand for a moment. "You shake it," Maddox said, "and with your hand." Vinsat looked at Rethis. Rethis gave the very slight headshake that means I'm not weighing in on this. Vinsat shook the hand, which brief, firm. He looked afterward at his own hand like he was checking whether it had changed. Maddox picked up her pack and walked toward the level 4 access without waiting to be told where they were going. She'd already been here 2 weeks, and she knew. I followed, and I wrote 741.16. Maddox, Reyna, Confederacy 14th Intelligence, detached in cooperative custody. Debrief scheduled in transit. Then, I wrote, she negotiated her own detention terms. She has been negotiating since before we knew she was here. Then, underneath, which I don't normally include in formal logs, but did this time, I'm beginning to suspect weren't the ones who found her. The transport back to command was 2 hours. Maddox slept for, to be fair, 90 minutes of it. Plus, this requires documentation, because it was the thing that generated the most conversation among Rethis' soldiers in the aftermath of the operation, more than the dampener, more than the boot print, more than the relay transmission. Vinsat brought it up in the debrief 3 separate times. She sat down. She adjusted, her pack behind her head. Honestly, her eyes closed. Within 4 minutes, her breathing changed into the long, regular pattern of sleep, and she didn't move again for an hour and a half. In a confined transport. Look, with 12 armed soldiers. On the way to a Dominion command post. Vinsat spent the first 20 minutes watching her for signs that the sleep was a performance. I know well because I was watching him watch her, which is my professional habit, and also, I acknowledge, moderately unsettling. Eventually, his expression pretty much shifted from tactical assessment to something more confused, and he turned to me and said very quietly, "Is she not concerned about her situation?" I thought about it. I think she's assessed her situation and decided concern isn't currently useful, I said. How can she do that? I didn't have an answer. I wrote the exchange down. The honest answer, which I've been working toward for several months now and still haven't fully reached, is something like, she had been alone in a dead station for 2 weeks, maintaining operational security, managing her rations, planning contingencies. The threat level of 12 Velhari soldiers with orders to avoid unnecessary conflict was, relative to the baseline conditions of her last 14 days, probably lower than whatever she'd been sleeping through already. She pretty much was not ignoring the danger. She had simply already calculated it, filed it, and moved on to the next item, which was, apparently, sleep, which I watched her sleep for the remaining 70 minutes of the transit. Not, for any professional reason. I kept my stylus moving, but mostly I wrote the same small notation over and over in slightly different words, the way you rotate a problem in your hands when you can't quite see the angle you need. Why does she seem less worried than we're? What does she know that makes this level of calm make sense? What did she send? Command posts like Vel 7 was not what I would call a welcoming environment, but it had the functional warmth of a place that had been operational long enough to accumulate the small human equivalent signs of habitation. Equipment stacked with personal organization systems that vary by user, a communal food station. That smelled faintly of overprocessed nutrients, and something sharper that I eventually identified as a Velhari spice common to the eastern colonies. Holographic maps that had been annotated in 3 different handwriting styles, indicating at least 3 separate senior officers who couldn't agree on the same color coding system. Maddox woke up when the transport docked. Not gradually. Immediately, eyes open, posture upright, pack in hand before the boarding ramp had finished extending. Whatever the sleep had been, it had been efficient. Commander Velsura met us at the ramp. Velsura was the kind of officer who had survived 30 years of service by being precisely, reliably, almost mechanically correct in every decision, and who regarded anything outside established protocol the way a precision instrument regarded a magnet, with the deep, structural unease of incompatible systems in proximity. She looked at Maddox. She looked at Rethis. She looked at me. I handed her my log. Physical copy. I always keep a physical copy. Old habit from my signals days when data was fragile and paper, irritatingly, was not. She looked, read the first 3 entries. Then, she looked up. Plus, she was in the sector for 2 weeks, she said. This was not a question. 14 days, confirmed minimum, I said. Possibly longer. Inside our blockade. Yes. Velsora looked at Maddox again. Maddox met the look without difficulty. She had the expression of someone who had met a great number of senior officers under a great number of circumstances and had developed a generalized protocol for it, which was remain still, remain polite, wait. What do you want? Velsora said, which a hot meal, Maddox said, and eventually a transfer to whatever neutral exchange point your protocols specify for cooperative detained contacts. Velsora's mouth did something that was not quite anything. That's all. I already sent the important part. She paused. Oh, and look, you're going to want to check your outer perimeter. The eastern approach, specifically. There's a gap in your sensor coverage about 40 spans wide at the third relay marker. I flagged it in my notes. For your benefit, Maddox said. Basically plus, not mine. I'm already inside. I was writing. I couldn't stop writing. Plus, the physical copy was nearly full. She found a gap in command's perimeter. She told him about it. She had no tactical reason to do so. She's been doing this the whole time. Giving us things. Small things. For what it's worth, the frequency log. Plus, the relay debrief. The perimeter gap. None of it required, and all of it offered. Why? They gave her a meal in the command post secondary bay. I sat across from her while she ate, and Vinsat stood at the door with the expression of someone who has been assigned a duty he doesn't fully understand and is compensating with posture. She ate the way she slept, efficiently, without ceremony. Dominion Field, I guess, rations, which my own unit approached with a complicated mixture of necessity and resignation. She didn't complain. Plus, I asked her the question that had been at the bottom of my list, the one I'd saved because I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. The perimeter gap. I guess, I said. You could have, used it. You were here for 2 weeks. You could have walked out. She chewed, swallowed. Set down the ration pack. Yeah, she said. But you didn't. No, I waited. The habit, in my opinion, of watching without filling silence. Another thing they teach you in signals training, the one lesson I actually retained without difficulty. I needed the relay, she said finally. Walking out meant the message didn't get sent. The message mattered more than the exit. What message could matter more than getting out? She looked at me. The direct look again. The considering one. The kind that means, she said, slowly, that other people don't have to come in. I wrote it down. 3 times, in slightly different forms, try to find the one that held the full weight of it. Then, I asked, where are you from? She looked almost surprised. Like then, Kerrigan Station. Outer Belt. She paused. It's for what it's worth, not there anymore. I said nothing. She picked up the ration pack again. That's fine, she said. Most things aren't. She said it the way you say something true that you have already finished grieving. Not flat, not hard, just settled. That to be fair, word for it in Velhari would be Thelsarin, the state of having completed the calculation, of knowing the loss is real and continuing anyway. I'd never heard a non-Velhari use that register before. I wasn't sure she knew she was using it. I wrote, she's from nowhere. She sent a message so that others wouldn't have to go where she went. She told us about our perimeter gap. She's the only person in this building who seems to know what's actually happening. I'm going to stop pretending I'm the one conducting this debrief. That night, Vel 7's artificial night cycle, lights down a cold, that the heating system didn't quite manage. I sat in the intelligence office and reviewed my logs. 41 entries. More than any operation of equivalent duration in my field record. Most of them precise, time-stamped, observational. A few of them something else. The last one I'd written was a single sentence, not part of the formal log structure, just a line at the bottom of the physical copy that I'd not entered into the official record. She's waiting for something. Not hiding, not surviving, not even, primarily, completing her mission. The mission was done, the message was sent. Waiting. I looked at the transmission frequency she had given us. The destination header, which the 2 neutral relay nodes. I looked at the eastern perimeter gap she had flagged. She had been inside our blockade for 2 weeks. She had found, our perimeter weakness. She had fixed a dead relay array and used it. She had been watching us since before we landed. She had sent a message to someone who needed to know where she was. I looked at the official Dominion threat assessment for Confederacy 14th Intelligence. Like 12 pages. Last updated 4 years ago, before the crescent belt engagement. The assessment ended with a probability estimate for the unit's operational continuity, which the analyst had set at 18% given the conditions of the last engagement. I looked at that estimate for a long time. Then, to be fair, I thought about a woman who had been living in a dead station in the dark for 2 weeks, rationing Veltar and maintaining sensor dampeners and quietly cataloging our perimeter gaps. 18%. I picked up my stylus. I wrote at the bottom of the physical log, in the smallest notation font I use when something is important enough that I don't want to accidentally skip over it. Reassess. Like urgently. Then I turned off the light and sat in the dark and listened to the station hum, and I thought about what she'd said. The kind of message that means other people don't have to come in. Other people. I thought about that for a long time. 6 days, honestly, after Maddox arrived at Vel 7, the outer eastern perimeter lit up. Not a probe, which not a sensor ghost. 43 distinct heat signatures moving in coordinated formation through the coverage gap she had flagged, and behind them. This is the part one have reviewed 40 times in my logs, and still find difficult to render in formal language. Behind them, another formation. 3 times the size. Different heat profile. Different, movement signature, which not Dominion. Not refugee. I was in the intelligence office when the alarm went up. I've been there most of the preceding 6 days, working through the transmission frequency analysis, and arguing with myself about conclusions I didn't want to reach. My Veltar was cold, which my stylus was nearly dead. I'd filled 2 complete physical logbooks and started a third. The alarm pulled me into the command center at a run, which is undignified for a field intelligence officer, and I don't normally do it, but the sound of the alarm had a particular register that my signals training translates involuntarily into move now, process later. Velsora was already at the command display. Rethis was beside her. Plus, Vinsat was at the secondary post with 3 other soldiers. The holographic map showed the eastern approach in sharp false color relief, the 43 signatures in tight formation, and behind them, the larger group, spreading into flanking positions with a practiced, unhurried precision of people who have done this before. What are we looking at? Velsora said. Not to me, but I answered. 2 distinct groups. The forward 43, to be fair, are moving fast, too coordinated for refugees. Heat profiles suggest light combat kit. The rear group, I checked the count on my scanner. 112, which heavier equipment. Different formation geometry. Confederacy? I looked at the formation geometry, at the pretty much movement signature, at the way the rear group was spreading without being directed by anything I could read on the sensors. No signal traffic, no communications burst. They were spreading because they had planned to spread before they arrived, which meant they already knew the terrain, which meant they've been watching this approach for a while, I said. The forward group, at minimum. Velsora looked at the eastern gap. At the position, actually, Maddox had flagged, and where's she? Velsora said. Maddox was in secondary bay 4, which not confined. Vel 7's protocols for cooperative detained contacts allowed movement within the post compound, and she had used that movement to spend most of the preceding 6 days either sleeping, eating, or sitting in the equipment repair bay watching Vel 7's technicians work in a way that the technicians had initially found disconcerting and, subsequently, I was told, began to find flattering. She was sitting on an equipment crate when Vinsat brought her to the command center. Pack on, as though she'd been waiting. She, for what it's worth, looked at the holographic map, at the 2 formations on the eastern approach. Then she looked at me. 6 days, she said. You knew they were coming, I said. I knew the message would get there. She looked at the map again. I didn't know it would be 6 days. That's faster than I expected. Who are they? The forward group is 14th Intelligence. What's left for what it's worth of it? A pause. The rear group is, she looked at Velsora. Are you familiar, I think, with the Confederacy 3rd Auxiliary? Velsora was very still. The 3rd Auxiliary was reported destroyed in the crescent belt engagement. 42 days ago, reported, Maddox said, and Velsora looked at the map. At the 112 signatures spreading with that quiet, already planned precision through the eastern approach. A force that had been declared dead 42 days ago, moving through a gap in Dominion sensor coverage that Maddox had located, mapped, and transmitted in a 14-character destination header to someone who needed to know where she was. I was writing fast. The stylus was dragging on the last of its charge, and I was writing anyway. She wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was waiting to be the door. What happened in the next 40 minutes is documented in the official Vel 7 incident log, which I have read, and which is in the clinical tradition of Dominion field reports, technically accurate, and emotionally equivalent to a schematic of an event that actually happened. I'll supplement it here. Velsora didn't have good options. A force that size, moving with that coordination, through a gap in her perimeter, the Dominion tactical doctrine for. That situation has 3 branches, all of them premised on the assumption that you're responding to a hostile incursion and should act accordingly. The problem was the forward group. The forward 43. Plus, they had stopped. 200 spans from the outer compound wall, the forward group had stopped moving and gone aground in a way that my scanner rendered as a sudden clean disappearance. 43 heat signatures gone to ambient within 40 seconds. Not eliminated, just perfectly suppressed, like a hand closing over a light source. They were still there. They had just stopped being readable. A hostile force stops at 200 spans to set up an attack line. They had done something else. There was a communication request on the standard band. Velhari, standard frequency, I guess diplomatic register. Rethus looked at Velsora, which Velsora looked at the map. At the signatures, well, that were no longer signatures. At the rear group that was still spreading calmly, taking up positions it had clearly planned in advance. I think she looked at Maddox. Is I guess this an attack? She said. Maddox tilted her head slightly. Not uncertainty. The angle of someone genuinely considering the precision of a question. Not yet, she said. What does not yet mean? It means the person on that comm channel wants to talk first. She paused. They usually do. Velsora took the communication. I won't reproduce the full exchange here. It is in the official log. Also in my physical notes, which I'm keeping separately for reasons I haven't yet fully defined. What I'll say is that the voice on the channel was Velhari standard with a particular cadence I recognize from the Dominion's language analysis files as the speech pattern of the Confederacy's senior field officers. Direct, unhurried, carrying a specific kind of authority that comes not from rank structure, but from the particular quality of having been in a situation long enough to understand it better than anyone else present. She said, "We're not here to take your post." Velsora said, "Then, what are you here for?" "A handoff." A pause. "You have like one of mine." Velsora looked at Maddox. Maddox was looking at the communication panel with an expression I'd not seen from her before. The closest thing I can locate in the Velhari emotional register is relvon, the recognition of something you were holding in reserve being finally acknowledged. Not relief exactly, which more like a calculation completing. She stepped forward. "Director," she said. "Maddox." The voice on the channel didn't change in pitch or cadence, but something shifted in it, the way a word changes texture when it means more than it says. "Good work. Took you long enough," Maddox said. "You went dark TBH on day 3. Plus, I defined you the slow way. I left you the frequency. You left me a frequency in a format idn't seen in 6 years." A pause that might, in another kind of conversation, have been warm. "Next time, try something I haven't retired." "Sure," Maddox said. "Next time." The not quite smile, small. Real. The negotiation that followed took 4 hours, which I logged all of it, but the shape of it was this. The Confederacy 3rd Auxiliary was not, as reported, destroyed. It had withdrawn. 42 days in the field, separated from supply lines, living on salvaged equipment, and what the Crescent Bell stations have been able to send through the gaps in Dominion sensor coverage. 112 personnel, down from the auxiliary's pre-engagement strength of 360, requesting a humanitarian transit through Vel 7 sector to reach Confederacy-controlled space. Not incursion. Honestly, a crossing. Velsora's options had not improved numerically. 112 combat-capable Confederacy personnel moving through her post sector was, by any strict reading of Dominion military code, an unacceptable security risk. The code had a decision tree for this. The decision tree had a preferred branch. Plus, Rethus knew the preferred branch. He said so, quietly, in a side conversation he pulled me into while the formal negotiation was ongoing in the main channel. "She should push them back," he said. "The perimeter is compromised, but the east approach is the only viable transit route. If we hold it, we can't hold it," I said. "We have the numbers, Rethus." I looked at my scanner. At the 112 signatures that were still spread in those quiet, planned flanking positions. At the 43 who had disappeared into the terrain 200 spans out. We have numbers on paper, not in that terrain. They've had 6 days to study this post. 42 days in the field. They know every approach, every sight line, and every gap in our coverage because Maddox flagged them and transmitted them to that director 6 days ago when we let her use the relay. Rethis was quiet for a moment. She, I guess, was giving them the intelligence. She was giving it to whoever needed it, I said. She also gave, in my opinion, it to us. The same gap, the same information. To both sides. He thought about that. Plus, why would she do that? I wrote it down before I answered, because I wanted the thought in the log in the exact shape it took when it arrived. Because a gap that both sides know about isn't a vulnerability anymore, I said. It's a door. And pretty much, door only works if both sides agree it's not a battlefield. Velsura authorized the transit. She wrote it up as a humanitarian accommodation under the Galactic Compact's Article 9 provisions, which technically applied, and which gave her enough procedural cover that Command's Review Board would find the decision defensible if they chose to be reasonable about it. I noted the phrase, if they chose, to be reasonable in my log, and added a secondary note. This is Velsura's version of Maddox. Everyone here's making decisions in the space between what the rules say and what the situation needs. The Confederacy 3rd Auxiliary moved through the eastern approach across a 12-hour window. In rotating, actually groups through the gap, past the outer perimeter sensors that had been stood down by. Velsura's direct order, into the transit corridor that would take them to the neutral sector exchange point. I stood at the inner perimeter checkpoint for 11 of those 12 hours. Compulsively logging. What I logged, 112 people who looked in the Velhari assessment framework, like people who had been in a very difficult place for a very long time and had not stopped because stopping was not something they had decided to do. Equipment patched and repatched. Supply loads distributed with the practiced inequality of a group that has learned to allocate by need rather than rank. 43 of them, the forward unit, the 14th Intelligence Remnant, moved past me, and each one acknowledged the checkpoint with a slight nod that I think was standard procedure for them. The way you mark a boundary you're grateful to have permission to cross. One of them stopped. A young one, honestly. They're hard to read, human age, but this one had the particular combination of bearing and visible exhaustion that reads as young in any species, the way high effort and incomplete where looks different from long effort and deep wear. She stopped at my checkpoint and looked at me. At my log. Plus, you write everything down, she said. The tone was not critical. More like confirming a thing she had already noticed. Yes, I said, and even this? Especially this. She looked at the log for a moment. At the pages. Then she nodded, the checkpoint nod, but with something slightly different in the angle of it. Good, she said. Plus, someone should. She moved on. Maddox left with them. That was the agreement, part of the handoff. Once the transit was authorized, she would accompany her unit through the corridor, and the cooperative detention protocol would transfer to the neutral exchange point along with the rest of the documentation. She came to the intelligence office to say goodbye. This was not required by any protocol. You know, she came anyway. Plus, I was at my desk with the 3rd log book, finishing the formal record of the transit authorization. She stood in the doorway for a moment with her pack on, and her eyes doing that scanning thing, the ambient survey, before she crossed the room and stopped at the edge of my desk. You'll write a report, she said. Many reports, and like I write everything, the right people need to read it. She was looking at my current log page, not reading it, just looking at the shape of it, the density of the notation, like the frequency analysis, the transit, what you figured out about the door. The door, I said. The gap. The information, which giving it to both sides. I looked at her. Was that planned? Or improvised? A pause. Plus genuine considération. Yes, she said, I think, and almost smiled. Basically, I wrote it down. Then I asked, will you do this again? Go into someone's blockade with a data drive and wait. Probably. She picked up my old flash from the desk, the one I'd given her on level 4, which she had returned at some point during the transit, and which I'd not noticed until now because I'd been too busy logging. She set it down again, carefully. The message always matters more than the exit. She held out her right hand. I guess I looked at it. At the burn scar that disappeared under the suit cuff. At the 4 repaired sections of the suit itself. At the actually pack that was too heavy for what it should contain because she was still carrying something in it that I didn't know about, and probably several things I didn't know about, and that was almost certainly entirely intentional. I shook her hand. Plus, she left. I heard her footsteps in the corridor for a while. Then, the post's ambient noise closed over them. I picked up my stylus. I wrote, 1847.03, Maddox, Reyna, Confederacy 14th Intelligence, Transit Authorized. Actually, Cooperative Detention Protocol, closed. Then, I wrote underneath, in the small private notation that I'd been using for 6 days. She came in alone. She carried her unit out behind her. She gave both sides the same door and trusted each side to choose not to make a battlefield. 12 people are in the transit corridor because she spent 2 weeks in the dark doing the math before anyone knew there was math to do. I closed the log, opened it again. I wrote, reassess human threat classification. Urgently. Not for the reasons command is going to think. Then I turned off the office light and sat in the dark and drank cold Veltar and listened to the station hum settle into its night cycle frequency. And I thought about what it means when the thing you were classifying as a threat turns out to be the thing that kept you from a worse one. I thought about Maddox and the dead relay station in the dark for 2 weeks. I thought about the note she'd made on the ration wrapper, the slash and the dot 3 times. I never found out what it meant. I added it to the list of questions. The list was at this point its own separate document. Outside the basically command post, the eastern approach was empty. The gap in the sensor coverage was there, same as it had always been. The to be fair difference was that now both sides knew about it, which meant basically, as I told Rethis, it was no longer a vulnerability. I sat with look that for a while. Then I opened a new logbook, wrote the date and time at the top, and started the report. The report took 11 days to reach command. I know because I have the transmission log. I also actually have the response log. The first response arrived on day 14, a standard receipt confirmation with a processing number, which is the bureaucratic equivalent of being told you've been heard and will be considered, which in the Velhari administrative architecture means approximately nothing. The second response arrived on day 19. It was a 3-line message from the Office of Senior Intelligence Director Velmath, which I shouldn't is 3 administrative levels above the office that typically handles field intelligence submissions from junior assessors. The message said, in its entirety, report received, classification escalated. You are requested, to attend a review session at Primary Command, Velsoth Station, at your earliest availability. Earliest availability is considered to be immediately. I drank my Veltar cold. It had been cold for most of the preceding 11 days. I'd been working. I wrote in my log, 1103.47, request for immediate attendance, Velsoth. Unclear if this is recognition or consequence. Possibly both. Then I packed my log books, all 4 of them, plus the physical copies, and book transport. Velsoth Station is the kind of place designed to make you feel the weight of the Dominion. Not unpleasantly, just accurately. Plus, the corridors are wide enough that 2 Velhari in full command kit can walk abreast with room to spare. The ceiling's high enough that the lighting falls at an angle that makes everything look slightly more significant than it is, and the air carries a trace mineral scent that the station's environmental systems add specifically because Dominion Administrative Research identified it 30 years ago as conducive to both focus and deference. I'm immune to the deference part. The focus part one already have, for better or worse. Director Velmath met me in a secondary conference room rather than the formal review chambers, which I noted as a tactical choice. The secondary rooms are smaller, less ceremonial, better for conversations that don't need an audience. She was older than I expected, and the kind of old that comes from a long time in intelligence work rather than from simple duration of life. She had the particular quality of stillness I associate with people who have spent years learning to read rooms, which in practice means they've become very good at being unreadable themselves. She had my report on the desk in front of her. Printed. 3 copies, one marked up in 2 different notation colors, one clean, one with its cover page detached, and set to the side in a way that might have been absent-minded and was almost certainly not. She looked at me for a moment. I sat down and put my logbook on the table. Brought the logs, she said, which I bring them everywhere, I said. It's a compulsion. I know. She looked at the logbook, then back at me. I read your service file before this meeting. It says, I'm going to quote exactly, Sevorin shows competent analytical capability consistently undermined by an excessive documentation habit that wastes operational time and generates volumes of secondary material with limited practical application. That's my fourth annual review, I said. The officer who wrote it was the one whose transport you flagged, she said. Yes. She looked at my report. The Null 9 incident alone generated 41 log entries across 6 hours. You wrote continuations at Vel 7 every day for 6 days. You stood it well. The transit checkpoint for 11 hours logging individual crossing data. Yes. And yet, she said, you're the only field intelligence officer in the Crescent Belt. Engagement to have produced a real-time account of a cooperative transit event involving a Confederacy auxiliary force that command officially listed as destroyed. She turned the report over. We had no prior intelligence on the auxiliary survival, no indication they had maintained operational coherence, and no awareness that the 14th intelligence had personnel inside our blockade. None of it. A pause. Until you logged it. I wrote the pause time in my log. Old habit. I should have flagged the frequency analysis earlier, I said. If I'd identified the destination header within the first 24 hours, you identified it in 72 hours, which is 69 hours faster than the Vel 7 technical team, who didn't identify it at all. She set the report down flat. Stop apologizing for the thing that makes you useful. I stopped. It required more effort than I expected. What followed was 3 hours of what Velmath called a review session and what I would more accurately describe as a reconstruction, a methodical, chronological unpacking of everything I'd observed, starting from the signal gap at 614.32 on the day we landed at Null 9, and moving forward through the relay transmission, the transit authorization, and the specific series of decisions Maddox had made that I'd logged in real time and spent the subsequent 3 weeks trying to understand. Velmath was a precise interviewer. She didn't ask about conclusions. She asked about observations, what I saw when I logged it, what framework I was applying when I logged it. And this question came up 4 separate times in different forms, where my frameworks had failed to account for what I was seeing. The 4th time she asked it, I gave her the clearest answer I'd. My frameworks assume, I said, that a rational actor under constraint will prioritize the minimization of their own risk. That's the foundational premise of Dominion threat assessment for foreign intelligence contacts. Every decision tree branches from it. And Maddox didn't minimize her own risk, Velmath said. She minimized someone else's. 112 people in a Confederacy unit that had been declared destroyed. She went into the blockade to make a crossing possible for people who couldn't make it themselves. I looked at my notes. The risk to herself was the instrument, not the obstacle. Velmath was quiet for a moment. The stillness she had, and the room's stillness. We have, she said, slowly, 41 years of Confederacy contact records. Standard assessments. Threat matrices, pretty much, cultural profiles. Do you know how the Human Strategic Doctrine section categorizes this type of behavior? I knew the files. I'd read them in the transit preparation weeks before the advance. Anomalous unit cohesion, I said. Listed under Category 7. Unverified. Unverified because we kept seeing it and couldn't make it fit the model. She looked at the report. An asset goes dark, which the mission is compromised. By every rational calculation, the asset should attempt extraction. Instead, the asset proceeds with the secondary objective, getting other people out, at personal cost, using the resources available, however, limited. A pause. We have 47 separate documented incidents of this behavioral pattern. 47 actually, times in 41 years. Different operators, different sectors, different mission profiles. The same pattern. It's not anomalous, I said. No. Velmath looked at me. It's not. I wrote. It's not the exception. It's the function. She showed me the broader picture then. Not all of it. Some of it was above my clearance, and Velmath was too precise to give me things NT earned, but enough. The Confederacy 3rd Auxiliary had not simply survived the Crescent Belt engagement. It had, over the 42 days of the Dominion advance, systematically mapped the sensor coverage gaps in 3 separate Dominion post sectors, transmitted that intelligence to Confederacy Command through a network of improvised relay nodes that used Dominion dead zone frequencies in a pattern that our TBH signals teams had classified as equipment interference, and positioned itself for a transit that would, once completed, put a combat-capable force of 112 back into Confederacy operational command at a point in the engagement where Confederacy strategic planners had already written off that capability. None of that was in any Dominion intelligence assessment. Not a fragment, because nobody had been looking for it. The auxiliary was listed as destroyed. Destroyed things don't generate intelligence activity. Destroyed things don't need monitoring. Who, I think, authorized the destruction listing? I asked. Velmath said, an assessment team in Sector Command, based on a TBH signal analysis. 42 days ago. She let that sit for a moment. The signal basically they analyzed was a Confederacy emergency beacon. Standard collapse pattern. Every known indicator of a unit in unrecoverable terminal disarray. Was the beacon real? The beacon was real. She looked at me. We're still working out whether the collapse was. I wrote that down very carefully. The beacon was real. The collapse may not have been. They sent honestly an authentic distress signal to indicate a defeat they had decided not to accept. I think I sat with that. I turned it over. I looked for the angle that made it make sense within any framework I'd been given for understanding strategic behavior. I couldn't find one. Not in any Dominion framework, which there's a word, I said, in the old human anthropological files, for a strategic doctrine built on the concept of, I don't have a direct Velhari translation. The closest is, honestly, something like sustained defiance without tactical justification. Continuing past the point where continuation makes rational sense. Velmotweitet. They have a word for it in their own language, I said. It doesn't translate well. The files just call it stubbornness. She looked at me for a moment. That's the light cultural profile category. Yes, it's listed under behavioral quirks. I closed my log for a moment. The only time in 3 weeks I'd closed it voluntarily in the middle of a conversation. I think it's doctrine. The second thing Velmath showed me was older. A file from the archive. Restricted access. The actually one I mentioned at the beginning of this account. The 41-year-old record describing a rearguard action at a place called Kessler's Ridge. The one filed under Category 7. Unverified. I read it in the conference room while Velmath sat across from me in that deliberate stillness of hers. The file was longer than I expected. The analyst who wrote it had been thorough in the way that analysts become thorough when they're genuinely unsettled. More detail than required, more notation than instructed, the written equivalent of checking the same lock twice. The final paragraph of the file read, Unit maintained active defensive operation for 19 days under continuous pressure from superior forces. No surrender indicator at any point. Final transmission at day 19 is non-tactical in nature. Identified as a musical composition, source species of origin confirmed as human. Classification of transmission content, undetermined. Classification of strategic significance, Category 7. In my opinion, recommend monitoring. And then, handwritten in the margin, someone had printed this file and made a note in the margin at some point in the last 41 years, in Velhari administrative script, in the small notation size that means private thought, not for formal record. Who fights for 19 days and sends music? I sat with the file for a long time. Then I thought about Maddox. Alone in a dead relay station. 14 days. Running out of Eltar. Making a handwritten mark on a ration wrapper in a script I didn't recognize. I thought about the 43 members of 14th Intelligence who had disappeared into terrain 200 spans from our perimeter and waited while someone on a comm channel asked for the courtesy of a door instead of a battle. I thought about the 112 who had been in the Crescent Belt for 42 days. Had sort of sent a real distress beacon to describe a defeat they had decided, collectively, not to experience. I picked up basically my stylus. The report I wrote after that meeting was longer than the first one. Not the formal report that had a specified format, a word limit, a submission protocol, all of which I follow because I have learned that the formal report is the vehicle and the log is the cargo, and you need both. The formal report went to Velmath's office 2 days later. 11 pages. Precise. Defensible. The log is what I'm drawing from now. In the log, the entry for the evening after the Velsoth meeting is the longest single entry in any of my 4 books. 37 pages. Most of it TBH is raw observation, timestamps, data points. The kind of material that my annual reviews have consistently characterized as excessive and which I have consistently been unable to stop producing. At the end of the 37 pages, I wrote 3 things. The first was a reassessment of the Category 7 behavioral pattern, the thing I called stubbornness, and which the archive had been filing under unverified for 41 years. My assessment, not a quirk, not an anomaly, a strategic orientation that operates on a different premise than the Velhari model, a premise I was still working to articulate precisely, but which I could approximate as the calculation includes outcomes that aren't personal. The rational actor isn't the individual. The rational actor is something larger than the individual, and the individual is the instrument. That's not how Velhari doctrine defines rationality. It's not how most of the species I've studied define it. It seemed, in my opinion, to be how they did, and the second thing I wrote was a methodological note about the signals analysis that had led to the auxiliary being listed as destroyed. The beacon had been real. Plus, the collapse pattern had been textbook. Our analysts had seen exactly what they were trained to look for, and they had categorized it correctly by every standard in our playbook. The playbook didn't have a section for. What if they sent a real signal to indicate a defeat they hadn't decided to accept yet? 42 days, 112 people. A signal that said we're gone while they were, very quietly, still there. I wrote, review signal analysis protocols. Current frameworks can't distinguish authentic distress from deliberate distress signal use. This, in my opinion, isn't an equipment problem. This is a conceptual gap. The third thing I wrote was shorter. I've been trying for 3 weeks to figure out the mark Maddox had made on a ration wrapper. The slash and the dot 3 times. I'd run it through the Dominion's linguistic database, the cultural symbol reference files, the military insignia records. Nothing. On the transit back from Velsoth, I'd pulled the original scan of the wrapper from my files and looked at it for a long time. Not trying, to identify it. Just looking, and then I'd recognized it. Not from a database, from a movement. Maddox, on the transport, from Null 9 to Vel 7. Adjusting her pack straps. A small, automatic gesture. The kind you make so many times it becomes reflex rather than action. Her thumb, pressing once, twice, 3 times against the pack's outer clip, the tactile equivalent of a counting pattern, rhythmic self-soothing. Slash. Dot. Slash. Dot which slash. Dot. Not a script. Not a symbol. A habit. The kind of thing you do without knowing you're doing it when you're managing something, when you're maintaining. She had been basically alone in that station for 2 weeks. She had, in my opinion, been, for 14 days, the only warm body in a cold, dark place, running her maintenance, routines, rationing her Veltar, keeping the sensors managed, doing the work. And every now and then, probably without thinking about it, she had made that mark. Slash. Dot. 3 times. I don't know what it meant to her. Maybe, I guess, it didn't mean anything in the way that compulsive habits often don't mean anything specific and mean everything in aggregate. I wrote it in the log, anyway. I wrote slash. Dot. Produce slash. Dot. Slash. Dot. She kept count of something or kept herself. Hard to distinguish at this range. Then I wrote the thing I'd been building toward for 4 logbooks and 3 weeks and a conversation in a conference room with a director who had 47 files that all told the same story. The archive has a 41-year-old record asking, who fights for 19 days and sends music? I don't think it's the right question. Plus, the right question is if they're still here, if the auxiliary that was destroyed isn't destroyed, if the unit that was declared gone is filing position reports through dead relay stations, if the force that should have broken 42 days ago is still moving through terrain it mapped on its own, then what does that tell us about the ones we declared gone before that? The ones from Kessler's Ridge, which the ones the record says sent music at the end. Were they sending a farewell? Or were they doing what Maddox did, telling someone where they were, which I finished the log entry at 0214 station time. Artificial night. The Veltar was cold. My stylus was actually dead, and I'd switched to a backup. I closed the book. I sat for a moment in the quiet of the transit cabin, which had the particular low hum of a ship at cruise velocity, a sound I'd cataloged in 11 different vessels across 17 deployments, and which I knew as well as my own breathing. I picked up the flask, shook it, empty, outside the viewport. Void Starfield. The particular dark between systems that has no feature and no edge, and which I have always found, for reasons I haven't been able to log precisely, both the most empty and the most full thing I regularly encounter. Somewhere in look, that dark, a signal was traveling. 14 characters, 2 neutral relay nodes, a destination I'd logged and passed to Velmath, and which was, according to her analysis. Team, a Confederacy command frequency registered to a division that had been quiet for 3 years. Quiet, not gone. I thought about the archive. Third sublevel, 41 years. Category 7, unverified. I thought about the analyst who had written who fights for 19 days and sends music in a margin 41 years ago, and then, apparently, filed the question along with the report and moved on. I wondered if they were still wondering. I opened the log to a fresh page. Wrote the date, the time, the ship's position coordinates. Force of habit. Old instinct. Then I wrote, for what it's worth, recommend the Category 7 archive be reclassified. Not as a lower threat tier. As a different kind of assessment entirely, we've been measuring the wrong variable. We kept looking for a breaking point. The data doesn't show a breaking point. I don't think it's because we didn't look hard enough. I capped the backup stylus, set it down. The ship hummed. The stars did what they do. I didn't write anything else that night. It TBH wasn't that there was nothing left to say. There was plenty. There's always plenty. I have 4 logbooks that prove it. It was that some of the questions are the kind you carry rather than answer. At some point you stop writing and just carry them, and the weight of them is its own kind of information. TBH, the slash, the duh. 3 times. Someone keeping count. Someone keeping themselves. Still there.